So far, we have seen the influence of coffee on societies in a variety of ways, mostly on the globalizing economy and on labor arrangements. This time, we move to the connections between coffee and political cultures in Islamic and European societies. Coffee itself as a beverage may have had a distinct effect on people, but we can be certain that the institution of the coffee house did play a significant role in transforming public cultures and stoking political changes, sometimes revolutionary transformations and changes. When coffee houses first came into existence, they either provided an entirely new social function as a public gathering place or altered the existing settings for people to meet publicly. In either instance, the coffee house continued older affinities for drinking interesting beverages, getting out to meet others, conversing about all kinds of topics, and having fun, while also introducing a setting in which consumption of a global product, in this case coffee, sensitized people to the happenings of the larger world, particularly the cultures, politics, and economies of other places. We can also identify two big patterns with coffee houses. First, the coffee house was one of the few public places where people from different economic and social classes, religions, and ethnic backgrounds came together for leisure, conversation, and exchange in globalizing societies. Second, the prominence of the coffee house can be correlated with the openness of cultural and political discourse in most of these globalizing societies. Coffee houses flourished at times when the desire for popular political participation was high, and the coffee houses were often primary targets for conservative governments that attempted to suppress popular political participation. So we can use the coffee houses as a gauge for the health of political engagement in a society. As long as the coffee houses were open, there was a public space for dissent and the potential for revolution regardless of the policies and structure of the state. As we know, coffee began its global journey beyond Ethiopia in the Islamic world. Muslims most responsible for spreading it were Sufis, who played interesting religious and social roles in the Islamic world as agents of alternative perceptions of Islam and as cultural brokers. In the first role, they advocated unconventional explorations of spirituality that often went against the prevailing religious authorities about what constituted proper belief and practice of Islam. For those who were not Sufis, one of the best ways to see what the Sufis were about was to go to the coffee houses, which were like rest stops on the Sufi circuit throughout the Islamic world. Sufi Muslims were entirely happy to share their insights and practices in the coffee houses. So the coffee houses became the primary site for expressions of religious dissent and challenges to religious authorities. In this way, the coffee houses were extensions of the mosque or masjid. They were places where Muslims could engage in religious matters, but outside the strict behaviors expected at a sacred site. This may have developed from the earliest coffee houses being part of the madrasa complex, which was the formative institution for education in Islamic societies. Nevertheless, the coffee house was essentially a secular space and was the only respectable place where men could gather publicly other than the mosque, and in a more relaxed, free-flowing manner. This interesting mixture was experienced by a French visitor to Persia in the 1670s who commented, quote, "Mullahs, dervishes, and poets take turns telling stories in verse or in prose," unquote. Here, the visitor is referring to the interaction of Shia holy men, mullahs, a certain group of Sufis, dervishes, and the verbal arts that have been so highly prized throughout the Middle East for countless generations. The coffee house was an ideal place for these cultural streams to merge, conflict, and ultimately to coexist, as the coffee kept people awake and stimulated for hours and hours of verbal jousting, dancing, and conversation. Once introduced, the coffee house became the most important location for secular public interactions in many Islamic societies. This continues into the present, and we can get a taste of this in a short video about the coffee house in Turkish society.
And coffee culture. Soon, coffee secures a place for itself in the everyday lives of ordinary people. And although coffee is still enjoyed in many domestic rituals, Turkish men come to prefer the public coffee houses.
Evimizde bir kahve kültürü var, kahve içme kültürü var. Sonra erkekler arasında toplanma yeri açısından bir kahve. İlk başlarda böyle namaz aralarında bir soluklanmak, bir vakit geçirmek amaçlı, sohbet etmek amaçlı. Oraya genelde Türk entelektüelleri, yazarlar, şairler, edebiyatçılar gidiyorlar. Orada sohbet ediyorlar. Çeşitli tartışmalar yapılıyor. Hatta bugün Anka Ormanlar'ın televizyonlarda bildiğiniz üzere günlük gazeteleri okurlar ve yorumlar yaparlar. İşte o zamanlar insanların tartıştığı, bilgi alışveriş içinde bulundukları bir yer olarak biliniyor. Kahve ve kahvehane özellikle insanların sohbet edip tartışmaları için, bir araya gelmeleri için çok önemli bir yer. Kahve de bunun için çok önemli bir araç. Ayrı bir atasözümüz vardır. Gönül ne kahve ister ne kahvehane, gönül dostu ister kahve bahane.
Coffee has always been
Just as the coffee houses were places to socialize with friends, they were places for political talk. The French traveler quoted earlier, Jean Chardin, also noted that, quote, people engage in conversation, for it is there that news is communicated and where those interested in politics criticize the government in all freedom and without being fearful. The political function of the coffee house has been central to coffee house culture in Egypt for many generations, as we see in this short video.
The cafe culture is very important to Egyptians because Egyptians are very outgoing people, very social people. You'll find that there was one or two cafes that played a central role in Egyptian culture. This cafe in particular, Cafe Riche, which was established in 1908, was very pivotal in Egyptian cultural and political life. When Egypt became a British protectorate and Britain was fighting World War I, this is where the 1919 rebellion was planned. This is where great writers like Naguib Mahfouz wrote and sat. After the January 25th revolution and the change in Egypt, younger crowds started to congregate here. I mean, electronic media and the internet played a vital role, but actually they met in coffee shops. All political movements in Egypt started in coffee shops. The Muslim Brotherhood, the communists started recruiting from coffee shops. If you want to be a successful politician in Egypt, you have to be in touch with the coffee shop crowd. Egyptian culture is very much influenced by this sense of, I would call it revolutionary romanticism, manifested in poetry, in revolutionary poetry and essays and novels and paintings, and that would attracted a lot of the youth of the revolution and the planners of the revolution to this place.
The earlier quote from Chardin that people could criticize the government in all freedom and without being fearful was not always true. Various states in the Islamic world attempted to shut down the coffee houses with very little success because they were seen as threats to the morality of society and the power of the state. Certainly, just as people could gather to drink coffee and recite poetry for hours and hours, they could also gather at night to drink coffee and complain about the government for hours and hours. As we see in the case of the coffee houses in Cairo, some of these gatherings led to the creation of political movements. It is very instructive to note that even as powerful states attempted to suppress the coffee house, they failed far more often than they succeeded, always as a result of pressure from the people who wanted their coffee and a place to meet for a wide range of purposes. When we turn to the coffee houses of Europe, which grew out of European contacts with the Islamic world and their long-standing fascination with the material cultures of Muslims, we see coffee houses at the forefront of social and political revolutions. Social revolutions assisted by the coffee houses included the liberalization of relations between people of different classes and the expansion of literacy and knowledge to those typically excluded from formal education. The political revolutions supported by the coffee houses were similar to what we have seen in the Islamic world, where coffee shops became places for intellectuals and politically minded people to gather to debate and to form associations that would contribute to vigorous political discourse and actual revolution. The presence of coffee houses in England grew rapidly after the establishment of the first coffee house in Oxford in 1650. By 1663, there were 80 coffee houses in London, and then more than 2,000 by 1700. These new institutions took on the old roles of the taverns, but they also allowed people to create new kinds of relationships as they were very different from the taverns. Indeed, they were open to men and women, all classes, and all political persuasions. According to one account from 1661, quote, "A coffee house is free to all comers, so they have human shape. Boldly, therefore, let any person who comes to drink coffee sit down in the very chair, for here a seat is to be given to no man. The great privilege of equality is only peculiar to the golden age and to a coffee house." Another account stated, "The coffee man admits of no distinction of persons, but gentleman, mechanic, lord, and scoundrel mix, and are all of a piece, as if they were resolved into their first principles." And we can see how this would be a big draw for people looking for contacts and interactions beyond the normal class-based behaviors enforced by the rigid social order of England in this time. But there were many other reasons for the popularity of the coffee houses. Above all, they served a relatively cheap commodity. Coffee could be less expensive than the usual booze at the taverns, and tea was not yet common enough in England to be cheap or popular. Further, people who drank coffee were far less annoying and violent than drunk people at the tavern. For some, sobriety was a virtue as well as a more pleasant state for socializing. It was normal for people of all ages to consume alcoholic beverages, so coffee presented a radical alternative that many found refreshing, especially since the caffeine in coffee was a potent stimulant and increased mental acuity, which is quite the opposite of the effects of alcohol. As in the Islamic world, people went to the coffee houses to catch up on news. These were places where the latest newspapers were sold, both local papers and papers from other cities, and those who couldn't read were treated to listening to others read aloud stories about people, places, and events from far away. Similarly, the coffee houses were gathering places for people associated with the universities. It was no coincidence that the earliest coffee houses were established near universities, as the caffeine and social setting allowed students to study better and the faculty to find a more relaxed setting to converse or just hang out. University people held learned discussions that all patrons could listen to and participate in, and this created the reputation of coffee houses as penny universities, since the tuition was merely the cost of a cup of coffee. Most coffee house patrons could not hope to attend university, and this gave them exposure to the ideas current in higher education. And of course, people talked politics, lots and lots of politics. This created a great deal of tension with the state authorities and conservative groups, as those who gathered to drink coffee and talk were often stigmatized as immoral, discontent rabble-rousers. Resistance to coffee houses and those who gathered there was based on a few ideas. First, coffee itself was seen as promoting anti-traditional behaviors. Sobriety was a new concept, as drinking ale and similar beverages was very common and thus a part of traditional behavior. While alcohol was available at some coffee houses and was often blended with coffee, coffee drinking was typically seen as an alternative to traditional drinking practices. So those who went there and drank the new beverage were seen as rejecting the usual traditional ways. Also, traditional taverns were notorious sites for wenching, which involved sexual hookups, whether it included prostitution or less professional engagements. Drinking booze and wenching went together and were seen as normal parts of normal behavior for males. Coffee houses, on the other hand, with their reputation for sobriety, did not promote this kind of interaction between men and women. Quite the opposite. Many coffee houses welcomed both men and women as patrons and were seen to support the idea of male and female equality because of this openness and the liberal politics often espoused in the coffee houses. The non-sexuality associated with the coffee house was also connected to the anti-sexual side effects attributed to coffee drinking. According to the Women's Petition of 1674, which was a piece of conservative political propaganda, coffee depleted the sexual abilities of English men. It stated, quote, "The excessive use of that newfangled, abominable, heathenish liquor called coffee has so eunuched our husbands and crippled our more kind gallants that they are become as impotent as age and as unfruitful as those deserts whence the unhappy berry is said to be brought." This was not intended to detail a legitimate medical consequence of coffee drinking. Instead, it was a way for conservative political groups to insult the manhood of the open-minded political dissenters who often frequented the coffee houses for caffeine, intellectual stimulation, and political conversation. This contributed to another criticism from English traditionalists. Coffee houses undermined political loyalty because they promoted free thought and discussion. Those who were open to new ideas and questioning the state and its authority were certainly not blindly loyal to any political power. For people who thought that the public should simply obey the king and the state, this was not a good thing. But many patrons were not just open to new political ideas. Many were interested in other cultures and wanted to experience something from the outside world in the coffee houses. Indeed, the coffee house itself with its exotic drink reached England from the Ottoman world, and it represented a long-standing English fascination with Turkish culture and the Islamic world. Remember, in the 1600s, when coffee houses took off in England, the great imperial power was the Ottoman Empire. Among other emotions, this drew the admiring interest of many people throughout Europe and England, even if people there also feared and despised Ottoman power. Further, many of the coffee houses included Turkish furnishings and serving dishes in their decor to provide an exotic setting for drinking coffee. As a result, political and cultural conservatives derided coffeemen as anti-Christian and pro-Muslim. Satirical poems from the era communicated this idea, such as the verse, "When coffee once was vended here, the Al-Quran shortly did appear," and another line, "For our reformers were such widgeons, new liquors brought in new religions." Coffee house patrons may not have been in favor of any religion, Islamic or new, as many were drawn to Enlightenment thought, which came to advocate secular political philosophies that saw all religious authorities as obstacles to real popular sovereignty. They were thus seen by conservative Anglicans as anti-Anglican and by conservative Catholics as anti-Catholic. These were the two competing religious affiliations battling for political control in England then, so it seems that the coffeemen just couldn't win in such a harsh climate of religious competition and violence. That, and not so much the coffee or coffee house, led many to reject the religious politics that prevailed. All of these negative characteristics assigned to coffee drinkers and coffee houses ultimately justified the government closure of coffee houses in 1675, as they were associated with rebellion and sedition. This was a lot like what we saw in the Islamic world, and the results were the same too. The suppression of coffee houses lasted only 2 weeks because many people of all persuasions wanted to protect this public sphere. As it turned out, the coffee houses were far more popular than conservatives thought, as were the ideas and political philosophies discussed in these places. Once again, the coffee houses revealed the limits of the state's power to control the people. For both political and economic reasons, tea came to predominate as the most popular drink by the mid-1700s. Tea not only became a fundamental part of British daily culture, but it also acquired an association with loyalty to the British way of life with its loyalty to the crown. This association was played upon in the rebellious North American colonies during the 1770s, as many people in America switched to coffee as the symbolic drink of resistance to the British government, much like the Boston Tea Party. Americans didn't just dump boxes of tea in one event, they reinvented their daily culture around coffee, not tea, to assert a new identity. Further, the Green Dragon Inn and Coffee House in Boston was regarded as the headquarters of the Revolution, as it became the leading gathering place for many of the intellectuals, politicians, and activists behind the rebellion. Coffee houses in France went a big step further. Paris had its first coffee house in the 1650s, like London, but they became much more prominent in the 1700s, especially as the French colony of Saint-Domingue became a leading producer of both coffee and sugar. According to popular mythology, Paris became a big cafe, which defined an era of sobriety and clear thought that led to the Revolution of 1789. The role of coffee as a powerfully cerebral drink was further mythologized in the French imagination by historians, most notably Jules Michelet. He linked the history of coffee to the history of the European Enlightenment. Quote, "The 3 ages of coffee are those of modern thought. They mark the solemn moments of the century of the spirit." To him, the first age was one of Arab coffee, which represented Europe opening up to the larger world. The second age was one of Indian coffee, which represented the volcanic birth of a new creative spirit. The third age was one of Caribbean coffee, which represented the deep strength of the mature intellect. Over these ages, France went from a peripheral kingdom to a major imperial power, which many, including Michelet, linked to larger processes of progress and the rise of European states as world powers. The culmination of the Century of the Spirit was the French Revolution in 1789, and the coffee houses of Paris were the staging grounds for the revolution. An English visitor, Arthur Young, commented on the Parisian cafes in the days leading up to the start of the revolution. Quote, "The coffee houses present yet more singular and astounding spectacles. They are not only crowded within, but other expectant crowds are at the doors and windows, listening à gorge déployée to certain orators who from chairs or tables harangue each his little audience. The eagerness with which they are heard, and the thunder of applause they receive for every sentiment of more than common hardiness or violence against the government, cannot easily be imagined. Further, the French politician Narcisse Achille de Salvandi claimed, quote, "No government can go against the sentiments of the cafes. The revolution took place because they were for the revolution." In addition to social and political revolutions associated with the coffee houses, we see the coffee houses as the sites for the beginnings of an economic revolution, that of global capitalism. London was the origin point for this revolution, and its coffee houses were no longer places for political radicals to gather, but a place for proto-capitalists to do business. Lloyd's Coffee House housed the Lloyd's of London Insurance Association, which made its initial fortune insuring shipping ventures, including slave ships carrying people from Africa to the Americas. The London Shipping Exchange was based at the Baltic Coffee House, and the East India Company was run from the Jerusalem Coffee House. Additionally, brokers who conducted their business between the many coffee houses formed the London Stock Exchange in 1773. The coffee houses of London were thus the wombs for the birth of the core institutions of global capitalism that drove the so-called business imperialism of the 19th and 20th centuries. So we see that coffee houses in the Islamic world, Europe, and the Americas fostered cultural and political exchange that contributed to significant processes in world history from the 18th century into the 20th century. But we have to be careful about attributing a noble status to the coffee houses and their patrons as though their very existence was essentially an expression of intellectual, political, and personal freedom. We cannot forget that coffee and the coffee houses existed because enslaved people grew the coffee and the sugar that most coffee drinkers in Europe and the Americas added to their coffee. Coffee was cheap and accessible because slavery made it cheap and accessible. So, the economic system of production and trade that supported the existence of the coffee houses was built on the exploitation of enslaved African-descended people. And yet, it was within these coffee houses that ideas about liberty were worked out and in some cases enacted that contributed to the political processes that ultimately led to the end of slavery in many places. The people who met in the coffee houses were an instrumental part of the larger story of liberal political and social revolutions that, among other things, included emancipation and the formation of states that embraced to one extent or another notions of the sovereignty of the people. It is interesting to note that in our society, the coffee house has made a big comeback within the past couple of decades. At this point, we see this largely as a consumer phenomenon and not part of any larger social or political shift. Indeed, that's how the coffee houses started in 17th century Europe. We have to ask, however, is the renaissance of the coffee house in the U.S. a signal of deeper social and political changes brewing within our cups of mocha this and latte that? It may seem like a silly question now, but our knowledge of world history suggests that we should wait and see if we are entering a new century of the spirit.